thinking and got it. Okay. The historical antecedents of intersectionality and in Black feminist thought, or I could have talked about the developments of intersectionality in the United States, where the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Or I could have talked about how intersectionality has traveled to different parts of the world, particularly to Europe. Or I could have talked about all of the criticisms that have been made over the past decades about intersectionality and the many debates that have emerged around the concept of intersectionality and how it's been used. So all of these topics are worthwhile topics to talk about, but we decided in the end that I would not talk about those topics particularly, but that I would talk about intersectionality as a methodology, as a critical methodology. In other words, how you can use it. And the reason that we decided to do that, well, there were really two reasons. The first reason is that this is a very diverse group, and maybe some of you are heavily invested in all of the debates around intersectionality and know all about them, but probably many of you are not. And one thing for sure, no matter whether you're whether you've been thinking about intersectionality and using it for years, or you're just sort of getting into it and thinking about what you can do with it, I think we all need to think more carefully about how we can actually use intersectionality to do the work we want to do. So that's something I think all of us share, myself included. And the second reason is more personal. The very first time I taught a class in intersectionality, and this is years and years ago, I made an important discovery, and that was, first of all, I offered this course. I was a visiting professor at a university in Germany, and I offered this course just kind of as something on the side, and it was totally packed. There were people sitting on the floor. I mean, everyone was really excited about it, and it was clear that all of the participants thought intersectionality was absolutely something they needed to know about, and that this was cutting edge critical gender studies, and they wanted to get on that boat. And at the same time, no one really knew what to do with it. I mean, they didn't really know how to use it in their research. They didn't really know what it meant to think about anything intersectionally. So that was kind of an interesting experience. And I would like to say that, that was years ago. And in the meantime, we all know how to use it. But unfortunately, that is not the case. And as Krista said, I was an editor of the European Journal of Women's Studies for many, many years. And one of the important features of our profile was that we wanted to support intersectional academic work. So we got a lot of articles that had intersectionality as their keyword, intersectionality in the title. It was almost a guarantee that you could get yourself published in our journal if you had intersectionality in your title or as a keyword. But what I noticed reading these articles was that the authors would mention intersectionality in the introduction. They would say, the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and then there would be a little history of the concept, and that was it. Then they went on, got down to business as usual. Wrote about whatever they were writing about, and intersectionality never appeared again in the rest of the article. So it wasn't really doing anything for them except to show their theoretical colors at the beginning of the article, or their political colors or whatever, showing that they were on the right side of the fence, but it wasn't actually helping them do their analysis or write their article. So this is the situation that I'm going to address today. So I'm going to be talking about how we can actually use intersectionality in our own work. I'm not going to give you a recipe, let alone, you know, kind of a full-fledged methodology for using intersectionality, but I'm going to give you some strategies on how to get started thinking intersectionally. And these are strategies that I know for a fact that you can use in research, because I use them in my own research and my students use them in their research. But I also think that you could use them if you're doing any kind of work where you want to be thinking intersectionally. This could be diversity programs. This could be policy making. I think these strategies are quite helpful. After my talk, we'll have a little break, and then contrary to what is in the description of today that you got, I've developed a little exercise for you. So the exercise will involve some writing and then talking with a partner about what you've written. And this is an exercise for how you can actually use intersectionality. It's about one of the strategies I'm going to be talking about. So for those of you who don't want to do the exercise, the break would be a time to leave, but I would urge you to stay for the exercise. It's quite interesting and also fun to do. So, but anyway, you know what you're getting into now. So now I'm going to put on my PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, let me start with the definition of intersectionality. Now, there are so many definitions out there, I hardly know where to begin, but this is one that I find useful. Why is this not? There, okay. Intersectionality refers to the interaction between gender, race, and other categories of difference in individual lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcomes of these interactions in terms of power. So what you can see with this definition is that it's about differences, but it's not just about any differences. It's about differences that are connected to power inequalities or hierarchies. So these are differences that make a difference in terms of people's experiences, in terms of the kind of constraints that they come up against in their lives. And it's about the opportunities that they are able to make use of or not make use of, depending on the context in which they live. The other thing about this definition is that you see that you can actually analyze intersectionality at different levels of social life. So you can analyze intersectionality in terms of people's individual biographies, life histories. You can analyze intersectionality in terms of social practices, institutional arrangements, or cultural discourses or ideologies. So, okay. Some of you are probably familiar, or I assume all of you are familiar with the person who coined the term intersectionality. That's Kimberly Crenshaw. You can see her picture in the middle. She coined it in 1989 in her research on anti-discrimination policy in the workforce and sexual violence against women of color. She was a US legal theorist. She argued that the experiences of women of color tend to fall between the cracks of both feminist and anti-racist discourse. She was concerned that both feminists and anti-racists were using a single axis analysis. By that, she meant either they were only looking at gender or they were only looking at race. And for that reason, this kind of analysis was inadequate and needed to be broadened in order to encompass the experiences of women of color. Many scholars cite 1989 and Crenshaw's work as the origins of intersectionality, but actually it has a much longer history. And Phoenix and Aftar Bra argued in 2004 that we should actually go all the way back to Sojourner Truth, and you can see her on the left, who was a formerly enslaved woman who made a memorable speech in 1851 in Akron, Ohio, which is always interesting for me because that's where my mother lived. But anyway, and I know the house where she made the speech. But she made this speech to an audience of abolitionists and women's rights advocates. And she made this famous statement: "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody helps me any best place. And ain't I a woman?" And this statement has been recycled many, many times, especially the term "and ain't I a woman," with the idea that, that obviously every woman in that room was not the same. And that it's important that you cannot think about gender apart from experiences that have to do with race and class and other inequalities. Since throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a lot of work being done in the field of Black feminism. Here you see one of the original anthologies in 1982 by Gloria Hull, who is now Bell Hooks, Patricia Scott, and Bonnie Smith, called "All the Women Are Right, All the Men Are Black, but Some of Us Are Brave." So the title really says it all. And even though the word intersectionality is not used in that book, the book is full of what you would call intersectional thinking, and an attempt to bring these differences together in the analysis. So in any case, there's been quite a long history of intersectional thinking. It's also, intersectionality has also become extremely popular in, not just in the US, but in Europe. Let me just show you some of the, and not all of the well-known intersectional theorists in Europe. Nira Yuval Davis at the top left, and next to Nina Lika in the middle, and then Helma Lutz to the right, and down below to the left, Gloria Wecker and Phoenix Sargas Salem. And these are just a few. There are many others that I could have mentioned. But in the last 2 decades, you could, or the last 3 decades, actually, you could say intersectionality has become a buzzword. There are conferences on intersectionality. Numerous articles have been written about intersectionality. Intersectionality is part of almost, I can't imagine a gender studies program that doesn't include courses on intersectionality. It's been the subject of special issues of all kinds of academic journals. It's a word that's being used in diversity programs in organizations. Policymakers use the word, and of course, social activists have taken up intersectionality in a very big way, calling themselves intersectional activists. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the meme that's on internet: "Feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit." So intersectionality is really everywhere now. The US intersectionality scholar Leslie McCall has argued that intersectionality is the most important theoretical contribution that, that women's studies has made so far. Those are pretty strong words, and ironically, as popular as intersectionality seems to be, many people still don't have a clear idea of how to actually use it. What is it that makes it so difficult to use. The first problem is that it's not quite clear what it is. Is it just a word? Is it just a concept or a term? Or is it a full-fledged theory? But what kind of a theory is it then? Is it a theory of identity, or what kind of theory is it? Maybe it's not a theory at all. Maybe it's better to see it as a methodology, as a way to analyze particular situations or practices. But then is it really a methodology? It doesn't look like the methodologies you see in the methodology textbooks. Some think it's nothing more than a heuristic device. And in fact, that's what Kimberly Crenshaw says herself. She said that's what she intended it to be, just something to kind of help you look at a situation a bit differently. Or is it a reading strategy? Is it a way to analyze all kinds of texts and images and practices? The second problem, and it's just the beginning of the problems, the second problem is, let's say I get this out of the way. Once you decide you're going to start using intersectionality to analyze something, then you run into all kinds of problems. The first problem you run into is the question, which categories should you choose for your analysis? Now, initially, or kind of early days in gender studies, it was pretty clear which categories you should use. Of course, you should always use gender, and then you should use race and class too. So the big three, they were kind of essential for any critical analysis. But of course, now there are many, many, many more differences that are considered important and important for understanding how power works. Helma Lutz has made an argument that there are 14 different categories that need to be taken into consideration: national belonging, religion, sexuality, able-bodiedness, sedentariness, on and on and on. So the list is potentially endless. So then the problem emerges, which you at a certain point you have to make a choice between which categories you're going to use for your intersectional analysis, and how do you make those kinds of decisions? How do you decide how many categories you need to make the analysis? How do you know when to stop looking for other categories? But then you're still not, even if you've made that decision, you're still not home free, because then you have the problem of what to do with these differences once you've decided which ones are relevant. How do you actually go about analyzing them? What does it mean to look at an intersection? How do you discover the dynamics of power in an intersection? Nirda Yuval Davis has written a lot about that. Or how do you look for transformations, or for change, for resistance? These are questions that immediately come up as soon as you want to do a critical intersectional analysis. And then the final problem is is intersectionality the only theory you need? Many people seem to believe, especially since it's become so popular, that it is the theory, and if you have this theory, you don't need anything else. But many others have argued that that's just not true, that intersectionality can't do all the work that needs to be done. For example, feminists in the global South have argued that intersectionality doesn't get you anywhere unless you combine it with post-colonial theory or with global perspectives on power. So that's another issue. What other theories do you need along with intersectionality? So this is just to say that it's not easy to do an intersectional analysis, that you encounter all kinds of difficulties right off the bat. So given this situation, perhaps it's not surprising that the call came for a methodology that would really allow us to use intersectionality, that would tell us how to go about using it. And here we're back to Leslie McCall. And she wrote a widely cited article in Signs, in the US journal Signs, in 2005, called The Complexity of Intersectionality. And she writes, what is restricting feminist research on intersectionality comes down primarily to methods, not substance, not theory, not philosophy. So her argument is that while intersectionality is really important, and remember, she was the one who said it was the most important contribution to gender studies, it's still very limited, and it's limited because it can't cope with all the complexity. So in order to do that, we need more stringent methodologies. And she's arguing for a quantitative methodology that would look at multiple relationships between multiple social groups across multiple analytic categories, rather than looking at individuals, single groups, single categories, or single sites. This would allow us to use intersectionality to encompass all possible intersections in a multi-comparative way. Okay, so this is a very interesting approach, and it certainly is useful and has been useful for many scholars who are doing quantitative research. However, it has some limitations, rather major limitations in my view. The first view is that it limits intersectionality to the social sciences, and not only to the social sciences, but to those who are doing quantitative research. So for scholars who are doing qualitative research, and that includes many of us who work in gender studies, or for scholars working in the humanities, this is not a useful methodology at all. But I think there's a more important reason why I don't think this is the most helpful way to go here. And that is, I think it shortchanges what I see as the potential of intersectionality as a way to do research creatively and critically. I believe that the strength of intersectionality does not lie in its ability to be a stringent methodology, but rather in its capacity to raise questions, to explore the kinds of assumptions that we make, and to reopen old debates and allow us to look at them in new ways. So for that, I'm going to offer an alternative, or another way of thinking about intersectionality as a methodology. And I'm going to leave in the middle whether it should be called a methodology or a heuristic device or an analytic strategy, which is probably my preference here. So my methodology, my critical methodology, begins with asking the other question. This was put forth by another US legal scholar, Maria Matsuda, in 1991. And reacting to the introduction of intersectionality, she wrote how she uses intersectionality. She says, "The way I try to understand the interconnection of all forms of subordination is through a method I call ask the other question. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this?" So this is in fact it looks like an easy thing to do. Any of us could do this. Of course, that's deceptive because it's only the beginning. Asking the only question is only the beginning of an analysis. Nevertheless, I think that it's a useful way to start doing an intersectional analysis, as opposed to just using intersectionality as your calling card. So now I'm going to give you 5 strategies kind of based on this idea of asking the other question. And these are strategies that I've used myself, that my students have used, and I hope that you'll find them useful yourself. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and I would encourage you to look for your own strategies here. This is not these are not the only ones that are possible. Okay, so here are my strategies for intersectional analysis. The first one is pretty much fairly obvious. Intersectionality was always about it was about complicating gender or complicating differences in general. What that means is that you assume right off the bat that nothing is ever only going to be about gender, or only going to be about racism, or only going to be about class. And it means looking at any kind of example and thinking, what else is this example about? So, for example, you might take an example that seems to be really all about gender, like the Me Too, the hashtag Me Too campaigns, or the problem of the glass ceiling, are examples of that are usually talked about in terms of gender and sexism, gender inequality. And yet all of these examples are begging for an ask the other question strategy. For example, the Me Too campaigns were notoriously led by affluent white celebrity speakers, and many poor women and women of color got kind of lost in the shuffle, even though it was originally developed by women of color. So this is an example where you would certainly want to ask the other question. But also the glass ceiling discussion. The glass ceiling looks very different if you think of a woman who's wearing a headscarf, for example. Her glass ceiling is not the same as a white ethnic Dutch woman wearing a power suit. So this is just kind of a basic way to complicate your analysis by asking the other question. The second strategy is understanding what is said and what is not. Public debates and discussions about policy always have areas that have been ignored and denied. And one of the ways to open this up for discussion is to think about what is actually not being said here. So, for example, in the Netherlands, gender and feminism for many years was hardly ever in the public arena, and you never read about it in newspapers. It wasn't discussed in any way, except in conjunction with migrant women, with Muslim women, and then suddenly gender became a big issue. This is a perfect area for kind of asking the other question: why is gender suddenly coming to the fore here, and why isn't it coming to the fore in other discussions? Or, for example, discussion about the participation society, which was prominent in the Netherlands, and there was no mention of what this would mean for. This was the idea of everyone should be taking care of everyone else. There was no mention of what this meant for people living with a disability or for the elderly. or for people in living under difficult economic circumstances. So these are kind of absences in discussions that you can look at with intersectionality. The third strategy is to use to look at intersectionality not as something, not just as a framework that we use as scholars, but as something ordinary people actually do in their everyday lives. And they're constantly drawing upon different identifications when they talk about their situation, when they try to negotiate the context in which they live. And I'll give you an example, a recent example. Helma Lutz and I are doing research on the South African activist and feminist Mamphela Ramphele, who was active in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And we did an oral history interview with her where we assumed at the beginning that she would be talking particularly about racism, because that was the context in which she was living, and she had been an activist. And to our surprise, that's not what she did. Throughout the interview, she was constantly talking about gender and gender inequalities and her feminism. And it kind of forced us to think about what kind of work this was doing for her in talking about her story, what it said about the interaction in the interview, talking to two white feminists, but also how she used gender and feminism to think about her own life. And it made us return to the context in South Africa and think in a more complicated way about the relationship between sexism and racism, gender inequality and racism. Okay, so that's the third strategy. The fourth one is a very helpful one, is asking the other question to examine your own myopias and blind spots. No matter how well-intentioned we all have, because of our social location or because of our experiences, we all have we all have certain blind spots. We're not able to see everything. We're not able to understand everything. And asking the other question is quite an easy way to make yourself look at what you might be missing. I mean, for example, I always ask myself, how is my being white, how does that affect what I'm seeing or not able to see? How might this look different for a person of color? Or what does it mean coming from the global north, the way I look at the way I analyze a particular situation? Where am I being unintentionally centrist, which is a huge liability when you come from the global north. So asking the other question is a way to kind of interrogate your own blind spots. And last but not least, I just wanted to include this. It maybe sounds a bit frivolous, but for those of you who do research, you know that there are always moments when you get totally stuck and you just feel you have nothing more to say. You've been over it again and again and again. It's boring you. It's just, you kind of want to give up and go home. In those moments, I found that asking the other question is an absolute boon, because it kind of allows you to it allows you to look at your material with fresh eyes and see things that maybe you hadn't seen before, and it kind of gets the creative juices flowing again. Okay, so those are my strategies. As I said, they're just kind of a beginning for an intersectional analysis. You may think of your own strategies. will these strategies resolve all of your problems as you down the line as you're doing your intersectional analysis? Absolutely not. But what they can do is this. They can help you make your analysis more complicated. They can help you figure out why things are said or not said. They can help you understand how your informants or your interview partners are telling their stories and what they think is important and why they tell their story in a particular way, and maybe why they leave certain things out of their stories. For those of you who do interview research, that's helpful. They can also help you be more reflexive about your own position as a researcher. And last but not least, they can help you be more creative and have more fun doing research. So thank you.